So what's the story behind this bike ride I'll be doing with my sisters, Julie and Mimi, and our friends, Sylvia and Tom, from Potsdam to Hamburg, Germany, from June 20th to June 24th, 2023. Well, as my sisters, Julia, Cecily, Mimi, and I were growing up, our mother, Annalisa, told us many times about how she escaped from the Russians on bicycle at the end of World War II. It was a story that said so much about my mother and her courage and resourcefulness, but also about war and its horrors. It's no wonder that Mom became steadfastly pacifist and anti-war, and that she ended up marrying a pacifist Quaker after she immigrated to the United States in the 1950s. Mom grew up in Potsdam, just outside of Berlin, kind of for Berlin what Versailles is to Paris, complete with a large royal palace and estate, Sanssouci, built by Frederick the Great in the middle of the 18th century. Mom told us that Sanssouci Park was like her playground as she was growing up as a girl. She was born in 1922 and was baptized in a church on the palace grounds. Annalisa lived in Potsdam with her parents, Erich and Frieda Sprecher, and her younger siblings, Ilse and Erich, my aunt and uncle. Potsdam wasn't a strategic target during World War II for the most part, and so it was spared from attack until the very end of the war. In late April 1945, the Russians were advancing towards Berlin from the east, and they started bombing Potsdam. Mom told us about being with her best friend Ulla during a bombing raid in the last days of April and how they sheltered under a doorframe with pillows over their heads until the bombing ended. As she walked home after that raid with a friend, there were small fires in the street, and when she got to her apartment building, the top floor was on fire. Her friend quickly ran for help, and the fire was contained. But scenes like that were everywhere in Germany up to the end of the war. That bombing raid was enough to convince Mom to get her mother and Ilse's son Ingo, my cousin, to flee Potsdam with her. So in the last days of April or the first days of May, we're still trying to figure all that out, they took a barge along the Havel River from Potsdam to Brandenburg, about 40 kilometers to the west. Mom said it was the last barge with people fleeing the Russians before they got to Potsdam. Her best friend Ulla decided to stay in Potsdam, optimistic that everything would be okay. Mom later learned that Ulla died during bombing on the last day of the war. Going west was key. People thought the Russians might meet up with the Americans and the British in Berlin at the end of the war, and so they would not go west of Berlin and Potsdam as the war was ending. It was well known that, among other things, the Russian soldiers and officers had free rein to pick out women of their choosing to rape. So the idea was to get someplace that the Americans or British and not the Russians would occupy at the end of the war. And at this point, everybody knew that the war was ending. In Brandenburg, Mom, her mother, and her sister, and her nephew, Ingo, sheltered in a basement. And soon enough, the Russians started bombing raids there. It was clear then that it would be the Russians, after all, who would come to Brandenburg. In the shelter, Mom met a woman named Frau Marx and her 16-year-old daughter, Trudy. Mom was desperate to flee to escape the Russians. She brought with her on the barge, amazingly really, her bicycle and a small bag with her camera and a few other special things. She started trying to convince Frau Marx, who was from Brandenburg and knew how to get out of the town, to flee with her. "Look at her and look at me," she said, pointing to Trudy. "We're the first two the Russians will take." But Frau Marx hesitated. She thought it might be best just to stay in the shelter where they were safe. Then, after a particularly strong bombing raid, Frau Marx agreed. And so they pulled the things together, hopped on their bikes, and headed out of town. The sirens announcing that the Russians would arrive at any time were blaring, and German soldiers were shouting at the three of them to get inside. Mom told us she yelled to Frau Marx and Trudy, "Pedal faster, pedal faster." She later learned that the Russians arrived at their shelter about a half hour after they fled. Her mother, who had a bad leg, and her sister, with her infant son, had no choice but to stay. My grandmother took out her false teeth to make herself less attractive, and that worked. Ilse, it is horribly painful to say, was not so lucky. It was May 3rd or 4th, 1945, and that flight from Brandenburg was the start of a journey of more than a week that took Mom to the small village of Lose north of Hamburg near the Danish border. Back in March 2014, I was visiting Mom at our family home in Western New York, and I noticed a small book with a faded flowery cover at the top of some things she was planning to take on a month-long trip to South Carolina. She was going, as she often said, to work on her story. I asked what the little book was, and she said it was her journal. What journal? I asked. From when I was a girl and a young woman. Well, it soon became clear that in this journal, Mom had written contemporaneous entries about her bike escape in May 1945. I couldn't believe I hadn't known about that book. Read it to me, I said. I was really excited. And so as I jotted down notes, the names of towns, what happened when and where, she read me excerpts with some of the details of the trip. I'll fill in some of those details as we report from our ride. The moments she described were sometimes full of suspense, sometimes emotionally wrought, sometimes full of tenderness and beauty. Mom never completed her story, but she did leave behind a patchwork of writings in English based on her memories and the journal. Then there's the journal itself. Well, if historians have been able to decipher the code of Hammurabi and ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics, maybe someone will one day be able to decipher Mom's journal, written in her notoriously challenging handwriting and in Schrift, German script that was the most common script taught in schools at the time and used in everyday life, but which the Nazis banned in 1941. It's not easy today to find someone who reads Sütterlin, but we are working on that. Meanwhile, Mom's writing in English, her conversation with me, her stories to all of us over the years, and what we can glean from the journal have helped us give the big picture of her bike escape along with some amazing details. In addition to taking down some notes, I made a Google map of all the towns that Mom mentioned in her journal that she stayed in and rode through on the way to Loza. And it was at that point that I decided that someday I hoped I would retrace that route, preferably by bicycle, but by car or train, or if need be. I mentioned this idea to family members, mom, siblings, cousins back in 2014, and the reaction was positive, but nothing materialized. And then in 22, I learned that the annual conference of the Global Ecological Integrity Group, which I regularly attend, would be in Potsdam in June 2023. Well, I thought it's now or never. So in December 2022, I sent a note to my sisters and cousins and asked who wanted to do this with me. Eventually, my sisters Julia and Mimi and Sylvia Mihich, who has been a dear friend since we were kids and who considered Annalisa her second mom, and Sylvia's husband Tom, made the commitment to join me on this bike ride. We're really hoping that Ilza's daughter Ina, our cousin, and her husband Klaus will also meet us at some point along the way. The next video will be about planning this trip.